Distinguished guests, I welcome you to tonight's conversation. In this video, we're talking about anti-Semitism, violence, racism, and fascism, along with probably other things I have forgotten. I recommend not watching this video until you've got a good chunk of time to sit with yourself and really reflect on what I'm saying, as well as making sure you care for yourself if you're in any way involved in this conversation. Pour yourself a nice drink. I know I've got one. How else would I get through this? Put on your thinking caps. And remember, I'm not an expert. I'm just a person with access to the internet and a camera. Shot 1. Anti-Semitism. Let's start with something before going any further. I'm Jewish. I have a family history of scattered Jewish relatives, and I'm religiously one as well. It made for a very awkward time going to a Christian university, let me tell you. Anti-Semitism is no theoretical matter for me. But, in theory, what is it? Quite simply, it is hatred of Jewish people. I know I point to her a lot, but Abigail Thorne of PhilosophyTube has a really great video for a primer on the topic. If you don't have time to watch that, the gist is that throughout all of human history, Jewish people have been oppressed for who we are. We date our oppression from our enslavement to the Egyptians back in biblical times, but for people who might take Exodus more metaphorically, there is historical evidence that the Babylonian exile was real. And then there was the time Rome destroyed our temple and started killing us, and then the time the Christians started killing us, and on and on and on. From ghettoization in Renaissance Europe to hate crimes in the United States today, and, yes, obviously, the Holocaust, people haven't really been fond of us. We've consistently been scapegoated. Anti-Semitism has led to what Nazis like to call the Jewish question. It boils down to this. What are we, good upstanding citizens, supposed to do about the Jews in our midst? And there have been different solutions. Sometimes there has been peaceful coexistence, but most often it involves restricting our freedoms, ghettoization, deportation, and murder. Anti-Semitism often goes hand in hand with fascism, which is not to say that all anti-Semites are fascists. But fascism is about preserving the nation and race above any individual and inherently views anyone who is not a part of the nation and race as an inherent threat that must be removed or even eradicated. So that brings up the question, why are Jews a threat to the nation and race? Shot 2. The present day. For as long as I've been on Twitter, there's been a debate about whether Jews are white. This debate is problematic for several reasons. First of all, it excludes Jews of color from the conversation. There are black Jews and Mexican Jews and Asian Jews and Jews of every race. But that's not the only problem with this discussion. It often ignores the idea of conditional whiteness. Whiteness is a category invented by Europeans we'd now, call white. We often think that race is inherent and immutable, but it's important to acknowledge that that's not true. The definition of race and races can change. For example, Italians and even Irish people used to not be counted as white. The idea of whiteness has always been a form of out-group bias, wherein it's not defined by who's included, but rather by who's excluded. For a long time, Jewish people were not considered white. And a lot of white supremacists still exclude us from the category today. But there are Jewish people whose ancestry is from nations that are considered white, whatever that means. And we, most of the time in current Western nations, are considered white. So unless you're a white supremacist, it's likely you view some Jewish people, probably including me, as white. Shot 3. Israel, Israel, and Israel. Because Jewish people used to not be considered white, we faced lots of violence in the past. The most famous instance of violence against Jewish people is the Holocaust. But even before Hitler's regime, many European nations had been trying to get rid of their Jewish populations. In 1980, under Emperor Tiberius, Jews were expelled from Rome for the first time. They were allowed back into Rome and exiled again a few times, but a precedent had been set. The idea was that whenever something was going wrong, Jewish folks could be scapegoated and exiled from the nation, something we observed in part 1. Here's where things get complicated. There's 3 working understandings of Israel. The first is the concept of Am Yisrael, which refers to the Jewish people. This is the idea, originating in the Hebrew Bible, that all Jewish people belong to one group, originating with the man named Israel. This even includes converts, as there's the belief that their soul was present when Moses received the law at Mount Sinai. How much of this is literal versus metaphorical depends on which Jew you ask. Today, the concept of Am Yisrael is the idea that all Jewish people are united by a common thread, and we should be working for the common good of each other. The second understanding of Israel is Eretz Yisrael, or the vague idea that Jewish people are entitled to their own sovereign state. This does not imply that Jewish people are entitled to modern-day Israel, or even any land in the Middle East at all. The belief is simply that somewhere, somehow, there should be a place for Jewish people to engage in autonomous self-rule, where we can be safe from anti-Semitism. This idea can be compared to the idea of indigenous people in the United States of America deserving their own land and autonomous self-government. The third and final understanding of Israel is Medinat Yisrael, the modern-day nation-state of Israel. The history of Jews settling in Palestine is long, beginning in 1492 or possibly earlier, because Jewish tradition holds that Eretz Yisrael should exist, and historically we have lived in the Levant. But the history of Medinat Yisrael really begins in 1881. This was when the first Aliyah, or return to Israel, occurred. There was a mass group of people escaping pogroms, anti-Semitic riots basically, who settled in the Levant. Between 1881 and 1939, there were 5 Aliyahs. This should not be confused with the modern-day idea of Aliyah, where individual Jews can be sponsored by the Israeli government to move to Israel. It's where the term and idea come from, but the 5 Aliyahs happened before Medinat Yisrael existed and were not organized by any government. All of this to say, there was a precedent of Jewish people returning to and living in the land we now call Palestine, in harmony with the native Palestinians. There were schools, synagogues, and even cities that were all Jewish. In 1918, Britain colonized Palestine, and in 1922, the League of Nations officially recognized British sovereignty after a history of conflict. This was when tensions between Palestinian Arabs and Jews who lived in Palestine started rising. Around the world, there had been restrictions on Jewish immigration, and these rules tightened as Nazi power grew. In fact, Britain restricted Jewish immigration to Palestine, but Jewish people were still in danger, and a mission called Aliyah Bet was organized to sneak Jews into Palestine. Aliyah Bet continued after World War II, and there was a long history of conflict between the Jews living in Palestine and Palestinian Arabs. The problem was that Jewish people had nowhere to go but Palestine. But the indigenous Palestinians also had a right to their homeland and were facing violence. Ultimately, in a move that was not endorsed by Palestinians, Israel was admitted a member of the United Nations by majority vote on May 11th, 1949. I feel like this is a good time to remind people that I am not a historian. My understanding of this history comes from a lot of Googling and some books, but I am not an expert. So, to go back to our ideas of Israel. Nobody is denying that Am Yisrael exists, and really only Nazis say that it shouldn't. Eretz Yisrael is a little more complicated, because some people believe that Jews shouldn't just live in the diaspora, or not the historical area that Jews occupied, but the rest of the world. But a lot of people support the idea of a Jewish nation. It's Medinat Yisrael, the existence of the current state of Israel, that's controversial, and for good reason. Jewish people had, and continue to have, a real need for a place to live. But Palestinians also have a right to their own autonomy. Shot 4. Fascism Revisited. So, what's going on in the Levant today? Lots of things, but we're concerning ourselves with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Today, and I mean right now, Israel is attempting to expand its borders into Palestinian territory through war crimes, and Palestinians are trying to defend themselves. Many people will come for me for saying that. They'll say that I'm not listening to both sides, or that I'm an anti-Semite. But the United States has a vested interest in keeping Israel going and making it look good. So a lot of media coverage that we see in the US is propaganda. I've seen tweets, articles, and even TikToks from Palestinians themselves exposing what is really going on. To see both sides of the issue is to acknowledge that since May 10th, 2021, at least 103 Palestinians have been killed, while 7 Israelis have been killed. Any death is a tragedy, I want to be clear. But these numbers are not the same. I want to revisit the idea of fascism, preserving the nation and race above any individual, and inherently viewing anyone who is not a part of that nation and race as an inherent threat that must be removed or even eradicated. At first, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict seems just like any other conflict over borders, but the effects of what's going on, and been going on for years, is the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. Israel restricts Palestinian rights to travel and even refuses to let Palestine import the materials needed to create the infrastructure to properly dispose of its waste, leading to toxic buildup of unprocessed materials. There is also the eviction and killing of Palestinians. Things might look bad for Israel, and comparisons could be drawn to fascist nations or even fascism itself, but I do not think Israel is a fascist state. I just think it's helpful to think of the comparisons. Shot 5. Where do we go from here? So I'm not actually taking real shots, or I would be drunk. This does have alcohol in it, but each drink is not equivalent to a shot. It seems that we've got a bit of a problem here, and I want to draw an analogy. Let's say there are 2 people, Amy and Bob, and let's say that there's a cake. Both Amy and Bob want the cake, but there's only one. In theory, they could split it, and that's the idea of the 2-state solution. But if Amy makes an attempt to seize the whole thing, complete with violence, the solution is not going to work. The state of Israel and the nation of Palestine cannot peacefully coexist. So what do we do? Much like I'm not a historian, I'm also not a politician. I don't know what to do. Calls for peace are only good if both sides listen. And then there's the question of policies going forward. Does Palestine get its land back? What are Jews entitled to, and what are Palestinians entitled to? I, personally, don't believe Medinat Yisrael has a right to exist. But it's here now. Should some country volunteer to create a different Eretz Yisrael? A Jewish state somewhere else? I don't think so either. I think all nations on earth should be welcoming, accepting of Jewish people, and that we shouldn't need a Jewish state. To be fair, anti-Semitism is real and something no Jew should have to endure, and a Jewish state would protect those who live in it. And I have nothing against those who want a Jewish state for their own safety, but I can't, in good faith, support the idea. So where do we go from here? I don't know. I have no idea. But I hope this helps you understand a bit more about what's going on and why it's so complicated.